Welcome back to the Talking Hedge. I'm Josh Kincaid. This is your cannabis business podcast. Today we are live at the World Trade Center. I am here with Jocelyn of Headset, and we are going to dive into a bunch of headset reports dating back from 2015 to present, kind of talk about how the industry has changed, where it's going, where it's been, a little bit of everything in between. So to kick it off, I'm just going to introduce Jocelyn Sheltraw. She's the Director of Regional Strategy at Headset. She's responsible for strategy and operations in California, along with all new emerging markets. Jocelyn spent 10 years working in digital advertising with brands like Flipboard and Uber, Pandora, SoundCloud. So she's an entrepreneur at heart, and Jocelyn just launched her own app. She sat on the leadership team for the nonprofit Women in Wireless and has advocated for women in technology leadership positions. And now she advocates against the social stigma of the cannabis consumer, and is here today to talk about all things data as it pertains to the cannabis industry. And so let's dive right into it. The title of this, to be quite candid with you, is something that's probably going to evolve as this podcast happens. It kind of started off as legal versus illegal, and the ramifications behind that as CBD kind of has taken over. A lot of people that were in the legal cannabis space has shifted to either black market or straight CBD. So we're kind of looking back to 2015 and beyond to see where we were and where the industry is. And so I'm in Washington, you're in California, and let's just dive right into it. So Washington had one of the earliest complaints among legal cannabis consumers that prices were exorbitant, and the initial supply was woefully inadequate to meet the demands of consumers who were paying well over $25 a gram. It's probably still the same people that are crying in Nevada right now. So as widely predicted, prices steadily declined over time, and in 2017, the average retail cost per gram declined by over 25% to just over $15, with the wholesale price dropping as low as 8 cents per gram last year in 2018. So much of the price drop can be traced to rapid introduction of new products at lower price points. So I'm curious, Jocelyn, the price pressures clearly had an effect on the industry. Is it too early to say whether the downward trend on cannabis prices have reached the bottom?
Well, I think in Washington, because you guys, came to market in 2014 and legalized a lot faster than markets like where I'm at in California, for example, just it's natural with evolution. As any industry matures, we tend to see prices decrease. And so right now, we actually just ran a report last week where we were looking at pricing trends of grams versus half grams for flower and as well as concentrates. And what we found is that in Washington, you guys actually have the lowest prices in market right now compared to Nevada, Colorado, and California. California, we're seeing the highest rates because, we're a newer industry or newer market to legalize, and we're going through a lot of price or policy and regulation changes. And so that's creating supply shortages, which therefore are creating increased prices. Now in Washington, it's a little bit different because you guys are a much more mature market. You have more supply, less issues with policy and regulation for some of these producers. And so we see that the average item price in Washington is $15.33. And to put that into context for other markets, Nevada, we see at $26.94. So again, this is average price across all categories. And right now, California is at the highest with $30.90.
Across all price categories. So that could be concentrated, could be
yeah, exactly. But looking at let's look at vape pens, for example, because in both of our markets and in Washington in particular, vape pens are one of the categories that is really a dominating category. And so when we're looking at vape pens in Washington, we see that the prices are still significantly decreased than what we're paying in a market like California. We're paying over $40 for a gram in California, whereas you guys are at about $24.
We started off really high. It was probably $60 to $80 for a gram. So it's definitely come down, but that's pretty crazy. A follow-up to that question is I've noticed, or I seem to have noticed, I'm not quite sure, I'd like some data behind it, that California leads the trends. Whenever a particular strain is popular, we've noticed that it comes from California around 18 months before it hits Washington State. And that in the meantime, it hits Denver about 6 months after becoming popular in California. And then 6 months after, or maybe even a year after it's popular in Denver, it'll finally come back to the West Coast in Washington. Is there a trend-setting person in California, or how does that happen, or am I wrong?
Well, I mean, I think if we look at just in our history, you know, California was the first state to legalize for medical. So we've, you know, been legalized since '96, and having great appellation for growing and having some of these innovators that have paved the way, like Jack Herrera, for example. We tend to see that in the Triangle or in Mendocino, and, you know, that a lot of these strains become really popular there. And I don't know whether it's just consumers kind of jump on that train of being like, this is the original OG Jack Herrera strain and so proud of these strains. And then it kind of trickles out. So I don't know that I can answer this question from a data perspective, but what I can say being in market in California is that right now there's this big conversation going on around, are consumers interested in strain, or are they interested in effect, meaning the feeling that you get? And so with that, there are a bunch of different groups that are trying to come up with some type of grading system for strains so that every other market can also look at these strains and then be able to, you know, replicate those strains because of popularity amongst consumers. The problem is that in every appellation, there's different growing conditions. So this is very similar to wine, right? Mm-hmm. Except the difference is that, you know, we can't predict the experience like we can with wine. And so the experience, if you're growing a Jack Herrera strain in Mendo, is going to be different than in Washington because of your growing conditions. So how do we come up with some type of grading system and account for all of those different variables that go into what makes a great strain?
So back in 2015, we saw that flower was the largest segment, but profits, as you know, one would expect, had declined slightly in every category except flower, pre-rolls, and edibles. So back then in 2015, pre-roll products barely held on to the position as the second largest segment. Concentrates coming in a close third, and vape pens not far behind that. Topicals and concentrates and capsules were the hottest products that following year in 2016, growing at double the average rate. So how do these trends relate to 2019, and which products do you see getting the majority of future sales?
Yep. Yeah. So the first thing I want to say about this, because I think it's really important and relevant to this conversation. So the way that we're collecting all this data, because I can answer this question very efficiently, but I think it's important for everyone to know, we're able to collect all of this data in real time because we have software that we give to a retail shop in which we're able to then plug in with their POS systems and analyze all this data in real time, and then we can report on these trends. So, you know, in a market like Washington, when we launched in market in 2014, we've been able to see all of this data from that. And so back in 2014 in Washington, yeah, you guys were seeing about 3/4 of your sales going to flower products. But, you know, as product innovation and technology has improved over the years, we're now seeing that there's more non-flower products entering the market, therefore driving in new consumers to the market. And so what this has meant is that, you know, we're seeing a lot of growth in non-inhalables. So categories like edibles, beverages, capsules, tinctures, sublinguals, topicals, we're seeing a lot more growth in those areas. And in fact, today in Washington, less than 50% of your market is made up of flower sales. So what this is saying to us is that consumers are really interested in trying new products, but when we're looking at the growth coming from non-inhalables, that could potentially be suggesting that they're interested in trying these other formats for potentially medical related reasons, especially when we look at the growth of like capsules and tinctures, sublinguals, and topicals. Those typically are ways to consume in which oftentimes are medical focused. But looking at data, like real-time data from today, the flower market in Washington, we're seeing at, let's see here. About 46% of your sales are going to flower, and pre-roll is about 10% of your sales. So the other areas, I mean, the vape market still significant portion of Washington sales, but the areas that are of most growth, which we're seeing about 80% growth versus last year, are topicals, tinctures, sublinguals, and edibles.
much smaller categories in absolute volume, but growing disproportionately.
Exactly. And like that data is really important because, if you are a producer that's thinking about coming into the market, you really need to think about the fact that in flower, even though it's making up about 40%, of your sales, there is a lot of competition in that market, and there's actually a decline in growth. We are seeing a negative growth rate of 6.54% in the flower category in Washington. So, it's really important to look at that data, because if it's a negative growth rate, yet only, under 50% of the sales, it's probably not a category I would want to enter in. Whereas, looking at other categories that are seeing, 80% growth, like topicals in specific, that's something I would want to be looking at as a producer.
I think you can make a really good case that what you're seeing is a delayed, almost identical response in the market to what we saw in the evolution of the medical market. That this is exactly the way the medical market grew. And it's a matter of consumer education. People become aware that other products are available. They're maybe more adaptable to the way they live or the way that they need to consume. As they become educated, they diversify across the market.
I think that's exactly right. And I think it's also about looking at the consumers as well. Right now, we're seeing the highest growth in consumer demographics is women 40 plus and senior citizens. So also, they're probably not wanting to light up a bowl, and they're probably wanting to have an edible or beverage or use it for medical reasons.
Exactly.
And so
I laugh when people tell me that the growth of the rec market is about stoners. I'm like, seriously? Have you looked at the data? It's soccer moms who've aged out and don't want to eat a whole bunch of pharmaceuticals. And they want things that make them not look like a stoner.
Exactly. And I think as we start to destigmatize, then it's going to be really interesting to see what happens as we allow advertising federally, or even in these markets. Once we can advertise on Google and Facebook at scale, then we really start to destigmatize cannabis, and then we see who the real consumers are, because they're not afraid to speak out and raise their hand saying, I want to light up a joint, or I use this for a topical, or whatever it may be.
So according to Headset's data, the first 6 months of legalization in Washington, you mentioned 77% of all sales went straight to flower. So refreshing that data, can you describe where the market is heading tomorrow?
For us, it's hard. We don't often do too many predictions on the future, because it's really important that we're just looking at transaction data of what's happening today. But as I referenced, like when we're looking at the areas of growth and we're looking at what percentage the growth is happening at a year-over-year rate, like it really is more of the non-inhalable and medical formats that we're seeing the growth in. So again, it's going to be the same categories I mentioned: topicals and tinctures, sublinguals, capsules. But one thing that I think is also really interesting in this, and Josh, we've kind of talked about this, but when people walk into a shop today, they're greeted with like a wide variety of different products that can meet so many different needs. And so we ran some tests, and we were looking at, how do consumers purchase in rural, suburban, and urban areas, and what were the differences in product trends. And so we don't really think about things in that way anymore, because right now there's this emergence of a number of different product SKUs that are being offered in shops. So we see that the average shop has, 1,000 different product SKUs. And we're finding that back in 2016, less than 15% of stores had more than 1,000 products on their shelves. Whereas today, this number is growing. So 45%, it's growing at 45%, with 7% of stores having more than 2,000 products. So this is a lot of product diversity that we're seeing on the shelves right now. And so again, what I can say to answer this question, as 77% of sales were flower when we first started, it's really signaling to us that consumers are interested in trying a wide variety of different products today. I think we will start to see more shops come into market that are more specialized and more focused, less product SKUs. As a consumer, that can be very, very overwhelming if you're walking into a shop with 1,000 to 2,000 different products. So yeah, I think it'll to be determined what it looks like, because it's just changing so quickly.
There is one dynamic that's going to drive it in a pretty predictable direction, however, and that is, at least for Washington State, Jim MacRae here. The chronic disproportionate ratios between our production capacity and the amount of product that's being consumed out of the recreational access point channel. There's been more product produced, significantly more product produced since we had detailed data for the entire state. It's been estimates since then, however, that then has been consumed out of the retail side. So that generally translates into growing inventories, the downward pressure on prices that we've seen, but also pretty clearly when you look at the bimodality, particularly of flower prices on the wholesale market, a lot of product and an increasing proportion of product appears to be going to post-processors for concentration. So every way I've looked at the data, it's very clear that there's got to be, unless there's an outlet for the product that's outside of the regulated market, a growing inventory of a lot of concentrate sitting out there. Concentrate prices appear to be plummeting, at least from a consumer's perspective. They're much cheaper. There are still premium products, but it's much cheaper on average. And some of the deals you can get are down $10, gram dabs type of thing. Never saw that in the Green Cross days. That over inventory that I am inferring of concentrate, which is in the dynamic underlying it, continuing to feed it, suggests to me that there will be increased growth in a more general sense in infused product categories that utilize those oils and the concentrates, which is exactly what we're seeing. And to your point, Jocelyn, I agree with you that the specific formulations of infused products that are kind of gearing towards medicinal uses, any topical applications, capsules, suppositories, patches, tinctures usually, the edibles for people that's just the way they do it. Those formulations are less stigmatized than smoking a joint or a bong or doing a dab or something like that. And they're, in many instances, as I'm sure Kat can attest, very, very effective ways at delivering the product to the point that it has a good action on the body. So I really do see going forward as the knowledge and the word of mouth amongst the middle-aged to senior categories, who in a pharmaceutical world are the ones that utilize 5 to 10 times as much pharmaceuticals as your average person does, are going to see the advantages, not only in terms of efficacy and lack of side effects, but on sheer fiscal cost benefit from a consumer perspective and from a patient perspective. Shifting some of their utilization of stuff to cannabis is just going to be huge. So I think they'll figure that out before pharma can, absolutely screws over the market with respect to the ability to do that. But it is an opportunity that the industry, many in the industry are obviously aware of and trying to capitalize on. And at least in the state of Washington, it would appear that many aspects of the legislation and even more aspects of the regulation that are being put in place almost appear to be there. I don't know if they're for a reason they were put there, but they seem to have the impact, they are having the impact of really holding down the adoption of what is considered to be formal regulated medicine in this state right now. It's ridiculously dysfunctional.
A lot of this shift, I think, from the decreasing in flower has a lot to do with money. So my understanding in Washington is a lot of farms have given flower to processors to make extracts. And yet there's no money exchange. So Washington regulators are stepping in to stop that. So as producers give processors flower to make oil, then those processors sell it to the retailers, get money, and then finally pay the producers because they don't have any money. And so they're really trying to stop that and force money to exchange hands. And so as flower prices decline, it's really just a shift in strategy to find a higher profit margin or something that's selling more, which is, as you mentioned, Jim, bringing prices down in oil, which will eventually bring prices down in finished edible products. All of it is around the money supply. And Kat, Grandma Kat's here. She was in the legal rec market and is here. And I want to applaud you to say that you are black market, right?
I don't prefer to call it black market. I
non-regulated.
It's a people's market. So much of the failure of the Washington market can be laid right at the feet of our legislature, who fiddled around for over a decade,
Mm-hmm.
failing to implement the will of the people.
Mm-hmm.
I operate in much the way that I believe the voters imagined medical cannabis was going to operate back in 1998. In that there were no profits. I probably pay as I go throughout the year to do what I do, which is to guarantee that children who are terminally and chronically ill can always be served without any type of cost. And we've had to negotiate. I've had to let go of my own commercial firm as the LCB got crossways with me in terms of what I could say about a medical product, whether it was a medical product, how to use a medical product. And this comes from decades of experience. I didn't make this stuff up. This wasn't something we came up with. So we've got people making laws who, are the least qualified to do so. And there comes in an easy place where you have to say, am I going to respond to my moral barometer? Or am I going to follow a regulated route that is more easily prescribed and followed? And I decided my moral barometer was probably much more important to me. So, yeah, I had to re-embrace the fact that the state made me an outlaw through its legalization plan. I didn't cause this. I simply want to help kids. And I think most voters in the state would probably agree with how I operate. So there you go. I embrace it fairly proudly.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you're here. Thank you.
Oh, well, privilege.
This is definitely a very important topic of conversation in California right now, as we're going through policies for SB 67 and trying to get all these temporary licenses for cultivators and distributors and retailers to have annual licenses. And so it's really hard, because without having the state approve these licenses to have all of these operators become legal, then it does continue to fuel the black market. And then what happens is, as we all see in legalized markets, consumers don't want to pay the 30%, additional taxes, and they're gonna, when they need their medicine, they're gonna go to the black market and pay the cheapest that they can for their medicine. And so, I don't know what the answer is. It's what a tough problem.
I would like to just add, I agree with you, but it's not always get the cheapest that they can.
That's right.
To go to the less regulated market. It's really, and I'll argue with you to the extent that I can see $10 dabs in recreational stores. I occasionally see $60 ounces in recreational stores. I don't see a whole lot of unregulated suppliers hitting those price levels. What I see is an alternative distribution network, which is not captured in any of the data that the state or the regulated access points pump into the system. And it's a market that, frankly, in my opinion, is probably as big, certainly in potential, if not actuality in terms of dollars transfers in Washington today, as is the regulated market. And that is a market that is based effectively on trust. I know the grower. I know the provider who saved my niece, and now I'm going to bring my child to her. I know that those people that are growing stuff, in many cases for their own family members, are not using the pesticides that appear to be rampant in the regulated system on their product. I trust them. And I will sometimes pay a premium for that product because I know there are strains there that are low yield, that commercial growers tend to stay away from. There's medicine that is available in these networks that is from trusted suppliers and has qualities that is simply not available in the regulated market. Now, a regulated market that embraces that, and more to the point, a set of regulations that enables the market to embrace that, possibly some legislation, but regulations for sure, is a market that would turn in, even under a less onerous tax structure, easily 1.5 to 2 times the revenue that the state is seeing today. So it's not just low price. It's a
quality question.
Bloomberg had an interesting video panel yesterday a discussion about black market Canada. As Canada legalized this last fall, they're seeing that there's a shift back to black market. And it's not because of price, it's because the Canadian retailers are having to return so much bad product. And then consumers are realizing that they're getting better options from their previous black market, non-regulated dealers. And so there's been kind of a regression, if you will. So it's definitely interesting. But I want to ask you more about other shifts in consumer and demographic trends. So there's available data that shows consumers have behaved differently in terms of price sensitivity. Men have been enthusiastically early adopters of legal cannabis and are still willing to spend more in most categories. But data shows that women make up a larger part of the market for Gen Xers and baby boomers than other generations at 35% and 38% respectively. For millennials, women make up 31% of purchases, while the silent generation that are 75 and older make the most male-dominated at only 22% of sales to women. So broken down by gender, price sensitivity appears to be the highest in women and among older consumers, although women tend to outspend men on edibles. Something I found really fascinating was the number one demographic for pre-rolls were the silent generation, older white women. I would have not expected that. So I'm wondering if you can talk about other shifts in consumer and demographic trends that you're seeing.
Yeah, those are some pretty great data points that you referenced. So let me add this then to that, because we partnered with our friends at Nielsen, and they conducted actually pretty interesting cannabis consumer survey for us. And we were looking at more trends in how much are they buying, how often are they visiting dispensaries. So given that you already touched on like what these, the age demographics, what we found really interesting is that the average consumer, and we were looking at this in all 4 legalized markets, so California, Colorado, Washington, and Nevada, we found that the average consumer is making, and again, like this is just the average consumer, is making 5.5 trips to a dispensary a year, and nearly 20% of those consumers are visiting a shop at least once a month. We also found that they're spending $51 per trip. And so just to put this like $51 into context, when we looked at what are people spending in grocery and alcohol, those numbers tend to be $20 to $40 per trip. So that's pretty incredible. If you think about like the basket size that people are purchasing, these are very high, and frequent purchasers. And we also found another interesting data point was that consumers, again, like they're not just smoking. Out of these purchases, 13% of these consumers did not purchase any inhalable product. So again, that's really confirming the data that we're seeing, that they're, these purchases are in probably the medical format that I had mentioned earlier.
Did you see the reduction in inhalables? That's very interesting. Did it pop in any demographic group specifically? The no inhalable purchase demographic? Was there anything? Was it older people?
I don't have any data on that. I mean, I'm sure we have any. I don't know that off the top of my head, but I think that would be very, interesting to look at. What I do know is that, millennials are making up less than 50% of the market, and they seem to be interested in trying all of these different formats. But I don't know, of that, how much of them are interested in just flower versus some of these other formats.
It's interesting to me because from a drug delivery standpoint, the big advantage that inhalables have is rapidity of onset. You smoke, you vape, you feel it within a minute or 2, 3 minutes, whatever, seconds. Virtually all of the other modes of administration, sublingual is different, but take longer. You get that slower, onset. It comes on within a period of time. It's gradual, lasts longer often. That's really interesting to me that people are in there buying 0 inhalables. That's part of any medicinal.
Well, that's why I think it's probably medical reasons in which that's happening, and that's not necessarily a headset analysis, but just would seem to make sense, right? Yep. Those are most likely if you're putting on a lotion or taking a capsule, that's most likely a medical reason. Yeah, which also, I think it's important to note that the CBD only market for recreational is 10% of the overall cannabis sales. So again, like that's suggesting medical reasons.
Where there's only CBD in the bag that they're buying.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Likely was.
So here's a follow-up question. With all of the cannabis marketing seeming to be directed at millennials as they dominate the market, while basket sizes have decreased, millennials have decreased the least. They were already buying more affordable items, and it may be a sign that their consumption is more durable than the rest of the generations. So wondering, open to anybody who's got a strong opinion, have you already begun to see this change as cannabis becomes mainstream?
Oh, the fall off and consumerism among young people.
Well, I guess the limited amount of millennials that have decreased their sales. And millennials seem to be a strong foothold, and they're decreasing the least. I'm wondering if you're seeing more mainstream reactions to the market.
Yeah, I just wanted to make certain. Yeah, I think it just is. And unlike many sins that might have been committed by prior generations to create that bad boy, bad girl image, you don't see that with cannabis. For many people, I think one of the things we all have to reconcile, almost all cannabis use at some level is a medicinal use, right? Even if you're just talking about washing away the stress of the day. So, you know, as it becomes more entrenched as the nutraceutical that the plant actually is, I think we'll see it in a myriad of ways, and it'll just be a part of our nutritional approach to life.
On the flip side, have you seen that the silent generation, the 75 and older, did they come back just as a novelty, try it once, and then say, forget it, that edible knocked me out, I'm done? Because it doesn't seem like that. It doesn't seem like the topicals and tinctures and the silent generation have increased as fast or as much as maybe we anticipated. Where, like you mentioned, Grandma Cat, where the millennials don't care, there is no stigma, and it's more of a lifestyle.
Well, one thing that consistent with your observation is that the millennial group in general was pretty much already established in their cannabis utilization. They were there. They figured out what they want. It was available. The switch to the new system maybe was a bit of a thing, but they didn't go crazy. More or less the same stuff was still available to them. They just kept what they were doing. Maybe more of them coming on board. With the other groups, you know, the people who used to smoke, had a corporate career for 30, 40 years, and now it's legal and they're going back to it. That type of people, and the people who by word of mouth have heard it could be good for pain or joint stiffness or whatever, they're going to go out there initially, possibly tentatively. They're going to try a little bit. The store is not too unpleasant an experience. Then they're going to probably try a whole bunch of different stuff and do a pulse. So you're going to see pulses in those people that will then settle down into probably, for most of them, a lower maintenance level that they find works for them. So I think that's what you may be seeing there with the decreases in some of the demographics. It's really being driven by an initial pulse of exploratory behavior on the part of the new consumer who they share in common naivete with respect to the existing market. Some of them are not completely naive to the products. It's been a long time and never in a regulated market. So you wouldn't expect to see that in the millennials as much because they just grew up with it. They were one of the biggest using groups to start with before we went regulated. So,
Jocelyn, do you have a personal opinion? Any data?
I have. Well, there's two things that I think are important about this. So one, I think it's really important to note that it is really hard to build a cannabis brand right now because advertising laws are so restricted. So when you can't advertise on Facebook and Google, as we were talking about earlier, your options then become to build an Instagram account, and hopefully you do it in the right way to build enough of a following and your account doesn't get shut down. And we see these accounts getting shut down left and right. So I think millennials, that is the demographic. They're on Instagram. If you have a brand, you're able to get your brand story across. You're able to build that with them, build that trust. But I do want to also say, I think a lot of the reason that people have had that experience with an edible in which they don't know, maybe they get a way too high and it's uncomfortable for them, is because, without regulation, without knowing the percentage of, THC that's in an edible, it can be a really scary experience because you don't know if you're taking a little bite, how much is that? But now with regulation, we've seen a decrease in the higher THC products to more low dosage products because people don't want to be out of control. They want to take a 5 little milligram gummy or a brownie, and they want to have consistency with an experience. So I think regulation is good, and that it makes it less scary, especially edibles or beverages, because consumers know what to expect. But with that, I think it's really hard to build your brands and to talk about, hey, we're this consistent quality, edible experience without being able to really advertise your brand. You have very limited options. You do event marketing, you go in and you do in-store promotion and you try to talk about your brand, or you build your Instagram and your, Facebook followings if you can, but you're very limited in your options to date. And so until we are federally legal, Facebook and Google are not going to move on these policies. And until then, cannabis brands aren't going to be able to tell their stories at scale and help consumers become more comfortable, therefore destigmatizing cannabis as a whole.
I want to make a point here too, and this is one of the ways in which we continue to act under a prohibition yoke, right? We keep talking, I've heard the number 30% bandied around as the taxation percent. Wait, stop the presses. This is just the state burden. Mm-hmm. Then we have the oppression of the federal government, which says, oh, this is prohibited stuff, so you don't get any tax deductions anyway. So their effective rate starts at about 40%. So it's not the 30%, it's the 40% on top of that. My son owns a retail shop here in Washington, and he did a breakdown of where the money goes. Scant little, like $1.67 of every $20 goes to the grower, and $1.67 goes to him. It works out roughly the same in the end, and that's where he gets to start paying his bills, So everyone is pitted against each other because, again, the wrong people are writing the laws. Give it up, guys. We long ago as a populace got over the fact that cannabis was somehow harmful to us. We get it, a 40 is more dangerous to our kids than cannabis. Yet the people who are in charge of these, writing these laws and enforcing these laws, act like it's the coming of the seven horsemen. And that's simply not where society is. So we're this weird mismatch, exactly as you point out. Education is the great rectifier for all things. And you hit all around that, both from an exact dosing point of view, which is generally only available in the regulated market, but you can't say truth there. To truth is spoken in that quasi-market where trust is established.
So let me ask you a follow-up question to that. It's interesting to note that price variances have increased from 2016 to 2017, and it seems to suggest that the market was maturing as consumers would have initially had fewer cues to guide their purchasing decisions. So it seems like producers and retailers have evolved their marketing techniques and were able to sell certain products for higher prices or begin using discounts more regularly. And so this whole normalization thing, it seems to be occurring. And I'm wondering if you feel that consumers are less in awe of the simple fact of being able to buy cannabis at retail outlets and have started to react more to traditional retail cues and just using cannabis as a regular commodity.
I think it is different in every state, though, because it's culturally attenuated. It is hard for the state to teach consumers about cannabis in Washington state or California state because we are culturally competent with the plant. We already have 1 degree familiarity with it. Almost everyone in Washington, California, Alaska knows someone who has been helped in an extreme way by the plant. You go to states like Montana, perhaps, or South Dakota, and people do not have that cultural familiarity with the plant. Yes. So there's always a coefficient, a number of coefficients around the plant, right? And usage that need to be taken into every scenario. I think one of the largest of them, though, is how familiar is your culture? Do they have people they've bought from years who probably still grow in their garage? Right? Or do they have to rely on regulation? Because before that, it was buying from sketchy guy on the corner, a quick dub sack, right? It is how enculturated your community is. There's no doubt that the terrain in Washington or California is very different from that what is going to be in Mississippi.
Mm. And so
I think
normalization.
CBD. Yeah, well, I think to answer your original question, one of the things that I find really interesting is that if we look at just CBD focused products, like CBD only products, we see that there's a 60% markup compared to non-CBD products for products in the same category. So meaning, it's a bit of a marketing, right, play. Like consumers have this perception, if it's healthier, you should pay more for it.
Is that 60% within the regulated market? So that's still a product that has excise tax and all that applied to it, correct?
Yeah, that is, so the 60% number is just looking at data from regulated markets. Again, California, Colorado, Washington, and Nevada.
That's interesting.
And wait a minute, stop the prices. Regulated market. Who's regulated market? FDA would tell you there is no regulated market, and they're currently running raids in New Mexico for CBD in regulated marketplaces.
That's the ones where they're putting it into food. You made it clear they're not supposed to be doing that outside of the regulated market, I think. But that's interesting. The markup differential on CBD products. I wasn't aware of that. I know that a number of the CBD plants, from a grower's perspective, are not as good yielders. They perhaps take longer to mature out. They're less cost efficient to produce. So they're more expensive.
Yeah, they yield about half as much.
But this is markups at retail. You're seeing they're bigger, so the profitability of the product plant is probably bigger at retail, correct? Huh.
Yeah, and this is I think brands know, and this isn't like a headset perspective. This is just an assumption I'm making. I think brands know that because consumers are willing to pay more for health-related products than an inebriation product, that they can then build more marketing around that, and they can therefore charge the retail shop more. So they get to increase their margins on that just because of the marketing around, the fact that consumers will pay more for a health and wellness product versus an inebriation product.
Yeah, I don't like the class. I understand it. And the CBD and THC being the two major cannabinoids that most states require labeling on, that most people's attention is focused on. This somewhat artificial differentiation of CBD into medicinal, THC into psychoactive. There's absolutely no question that THC is more psychoactive than CBD. But the notion that CBD is medicinal fundamentally and that THC is recreational fundamentally is simply false. THC has medicinal qualities. THC on board with CBD, most of the people that are in this game will tell you, has much more medicinal impact than CBD in isolation. I see the whole CBD equals medicine, THC equals recreation thing as a big first step in enculturating people into what pharma wants to see 10 years from now, which is this is medicine and this is not. And this medicine can be put in a pill and this cannot. And if they do that, first of all, the consumers and the patients suffer because they will not have as effective a medicine.
Correct.
And we will lose potentially the knowledge, not codified in FDA-controlled clinical trials to date, but the extensive knowledge about how these products work medicinally and effectively. So I'm a little worried when people go into their local cafe here and get a CBD shot in their latte, which you can do 300 feet from the LCB main offices right now, and which is illegal federally, I gather.
LCB being the Liquor and Cannabis Board, the regulatory agency in Washington.
But for people to do that and to think that they're going to get joint pain relief from that, they may, some of them probably will. But to think, if they do that and they don't get any relief, they'll devalue the concept of the cannabinoids as medicine as well, which is also doing an injustice to themselves and to the potential of the market. So I'm a little worried, sorry for jumping in on that, about referring to CBD as medicinal and THC as recreational. Yes, there are tendencies there, but it is not an either or. And if you put a combination, having judged the Terp Festival recently, you get a whole bunch of middle of the road THC products together, and their effects psychoactively can run a spectrum from you feel like you're on speed to you feel like you can't get off the couch, literally. And that is not all in the cannabinoids. There's something else going on there to have that degree of diversity of effect. So I don't know, sorry to jump on that. It is obviously the way consumers are increasingly thinking. I think the market is doing itself a disservice if it allows it to go down that path too much, because there's so much more to what this market could offer than just go for Everclear. It's your most cost-effective way to get drunk.
Well, and let me add one contextual layer to that, you certainly hit a lot of the high points, but what if I told you you didn't have to get high with THC? You know, which was one of your original premises as true, and that's not necessarily true. There are many ways to access THC, and they do not all have to get you high.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So
yeah, I think just that's the last thing on that, just to put this into context. And again, like, I have no perspective on this, whether it does or doesn't, but if we just look at tinctures alone, what the average item price for a tincture is $21.69 for a THC tincture, whereas the average price for a CBD focused tincture is $37.87. So that is a, pretty drastic price discrepancy just for a simple, essentially marketing.
Yeah.
Right. Are they both like 100 milligram maximum type of thing, that the same rules?
It's I don't have any data on the percentage of THC in the non-CBD focused category. It's just, we're looking at what are the predominantly CBD tinctures versus every other THC tincture, and that's where we see that much of a price differential.
That's really ironic too, because so much of the CBD now is being sourced in bulk, from not even cannabis derived sources in many instances. So CBD is a lot cheaper than THC, and yet it's commanding a price premium. Wow, profit city. Okay.
I mean, this is the consumer packaged goods industry.
Yeah, folks often ask me why I don't do a CBD line. It's like, I just do full plant extracts, why complicate things?
They work.
Exactly.
So marketing and advertising has come up. We obviously know that it's highly competitive industry. And so I want to go back to a point that you brought up earlier, which is the difficulty of advertising and branding within this fierce competitive industry. So during 2017, the average item price ranged from $15 to $30 across the 4 legal states that you mentioned earlier, and that the lowest occurring in states that have had more time with legal cannabis markets. So this makes sense, as prices tend to fall when production ramps up to meet demand. So the first day of legal cannabis sales in Washington state saw grams of cannabis being sold as much as $30, which is unheard of now. So in order to outcompete the non-regulated markets, the legal cannabis market has been trying to undersell them. So does the small producer stand a chance to compete against these larger corporations coming into the market? And how can they stand out, given that there are few options to advertise a brand?
I mean, I think they can. I think it's about telling the right story and telling it, understanding who your audience is. Like, if you are making a tincture, not all tinctures are going to be the same. So like, think about who you want to target that tincture to. If it's women 40 plus, then you have to tell your story, and you have to tell your story in the platforms in which you can do it, because you're not able to do that at scale. So you're going to need to figure out how to do that with, your Instagram channels, your event marketing, your influencers, whoever that may be. But it's it's more grassroots way in which brands are having to build a brand right now. One of the really interesting things, I think, from a data perspective, is that we do see that the percentage of sales in each market is very concentrated to a few brands. So in California, we see that 5 brands make up 24% of our total sales. We see the bottom 200 brands make up 6% of sales. So those 200 brands are competing for the 6% market share, knowing that they're competing against these big corporations that are making up market share. When those big corporations, of course, do have more ability to do these, grassroots campaigns and figure out how to, make marketing work for them. Whereas a smaller producer, you're trying to build your audience on a social media channel and hope that people understand your story. So I think it's entirely possible. I think we see that happening in California. We see a lot of these, small brands become part of bigger groups like Flowcana, for example, right? We see a lot, they really care about the Mendocino farmer. And what they want to do is they want to share the local farmer's story. And so they do a really great job of helping consumers understand, this is the farmer. This is literally like showing a picture. This is who is, growing your flower. This is who's trimming it. This is who's packaging it for you. So I think the small brand absolutely has a chance. It'll be very similar to the beer industry, the craft beer industry. It's just about understanding who your consumer is, not trying to be too broad, but being very focused, and then understanding how to reach that consumer and really tell your story to make your brand stand out.
Yep. In Washington State right now, I agree, Jocelyn. In Washington State right now, there are about 1,200 licensed wholesalers. If you look at the sales data for the last year, there's about 700 of them that have actually generated some sales revenue. So let's just say there's 700 active wholesalers in the state. The top 7 of those represent 24.3% of the sales revenue on wholesale over the last 12-month period. So that Pareto chart is really quite less than 1% of the businesses are generating a quarter of the revenue in the market. The little guys and gals, the tier 1s particularly in our state that are limited by rule to 2,000 square feet of canopy apiece maximum, those small operators simply cannot produce in a cost competitive fashion with the big players. They just can't. You can certainly do some things, I'm not an expert in it, but if you can minimize your cost of inputs and just guarantee a kick-ass quality product that's really consistent and in some way differentiable, how you grew it, whatever, those niche brands on the small side will be able to thrive. Will they be able to explode into hugeness? Probably not immediately, but yes, they will. But I suspect if we look back 2 to 3 years from now at Washington, at the proportion of existing tier 3, tier 2, and tier 1 licensees on the wholesale side that are still in business, it will be a much higher percentage of the big players, the tier 3s, than the tier 1s. The tier 1s that survive will have a niche following for their brands. They will be the that specific chateau in France that makes the thing only once every 3 years when the grapes are just right.
A loyalty effect.
Yeah, exactly. But premium as well, because they're going to have to charge more. And
yeah, I think that's right. And Washington is interesting because, in particular, your market is much less concentrated than some other markets that we see. So your top 5 brands make up 18% of sales, whereas a market like Colorado, their top 5 brands make up 33% of sales. Yep. Or as I mentioned, in California, they make up 24%. I don't know why the difference in Washington takes place like that. Maybe just your culture and socially are more open and less focused on the big brand stores. I don't know.
We don't do vertical integration. Our market is set up completely for separation between processor, wholesalers, and retailers. I mean, from the ground up, and we're unique in that respect, I think. Whereas Colorado built on a market where you grew, processed, and largely sold your own stuff. And it's still like that. I think there's ratios that they're allowed to sell of their own and stuff. But because of that, the incentive in Colorado, when I have one of my retail access points, I'm going to be pushing my product, the stuff that my growers grew or that my processor put together. So it will tend to lead to that concentration more so. In Washington, they went the exact opposite. They said, we want no tied house stuff, no undue influence between retailers and wholesalers. And at least the legislators said, we want the little guys and gals to be able to survive and thrive, hence the tier 1 structure. Of course, then their regulation for the next 5 years basically stuck it to the little guys, because the big guys and gals have been better able to do regulatory capture in this state, and they've done it extraordinarily quickly. So
that makes complete sense. That's probably why, because California, we allow vertical integration as well, which would make sense for our concentration as well.
Yeah, and Washington is unique in that regard, I think, nationally right now. So we're a little weird that way, but it's an interesting observation on something that makes a lot of things fundamentally different about the market.
There were any number of ways in which we could have chosen to have gone. Certainly Colorado was much larger oriented in going straight out. A conspiracy theorist would say it was designed to decapitate the historical black market. At least that's been the effect by and large. either by refusing to licensing them or by creating a situation in which it was so unfriendly to historical players who brought limited capital by nature, by the fact that we've rarely been able to put our money in banks, right, and establish our incomes. So the field was tilted against us. The optimist would say we gave independent people a chance to compete fairly. Yet we weren't prepared, many of us, for this as a historical culture, you know. And I think somewhere we asked a question: is it fait accompli that we're going to be bulldozed? Yeah. Why would cannabis be any different than any other business in which our government continues to regulate in favor of large multinationals? There will be small pockets of resistance to that market oppression, but it'll be about education, as you originally mentioned.
So I think it was the House Congressional Committee on Banking. They just passed a bill, and that's huge. And so, Grandma Cat, I'm going to throw this one to you, wondering how that's going to change the game, if at all. And I'll give you a little quote here. I found the Canadian Imperial Bank of Commerce quote interesting. They said that the movement towards legalization is a global trend that's merely getting started. And there are likely far greater uses for the plant beyond adults choosing to consume the product for leisure. They truly believe that we are in the early stages of what will be a global shift on the subject and could be witnessing a transfer of wealth from illicit to legitimate markets. That's a rarity in history. So small business lending has always had a diversity problem, so it shouldn't come as any surprise that the lack of capital is the biggest barrier to entry in minority-owned cannabis firms as well. So Grandma Cat, do you think that it would make an impact if banks develop or implement lending programs to support minority and women-owned businesses, specifically in the hemp and cannabis industry? Would legal banking even matter?
I was going to say, I think there's a couple of questions here. Clearly, with us dumping billions and billions of dollars into this industry, well, we've long ago given up whether banking happened for us or not, right? So banking really is, it would be easier, but we've learned to work around it, just like all other things with nascent legalization. But I think what this makes an assumption that we are all happy with the idea of legalization. And that's an entirely different supposition than asking for and being happy with freedom. I think we are at a pivotal point where our culture gets to decide, and I mean right now, are we going to continue to fight for freedom? And that means cannabis is just like a corn plant or a tomato plant. Or are we going to accept legalization, which means essentially continued prohibition? In other words, yeah, you can have a little bit, decriminalization, but with my boot on my throat, and I get to determine your adult agency to know how much you need to heal your mother who might be dying of some type of god-awful disease that is remedied by larger amounts of cannabis than the law anticipates. And there are so many mismatches. In states where we have grow laws, we say, but you can have 4 ounces. Well, you got to be a crappy grower to only get 4 ounces off a couple of plants outside, just saying. So we've already anticipated a way in which we should rectify through some type of co-op, I don't know, but a more free market approach, a risk-tolerant approach to cannabis that lets go of these lies, which we've decided over and over again at the ballot box are lies, but then we turn around and give the people least, able to make sensical laws, the right to make the laws, and they laugh and point at us and call us outlaws and liars and cheats and greedy as we try to make sense to bear upon these situations. I like to recommend folks in Washington, for me, legalization is hard. I like, tell it to the Donner Party. Making history is hard. And
I can comment from
please.
a social equity perspective in California, because actually this is a really important topic right now in which we're addressing. And the news yesterday, I mean, this is a historic milestone for the cannabis industry, and it's really important to note that. So what happened is, you know, the House Financial Services Committee, they approved the updated version of the Safe Banking Act. And this is really important because what was happening is, you know, operating in cash businesses, these businesses are naturally a target. So we saw increased robberies, we saw increased crime. And so now that financial institutions are able to work with these cannabis companies if they choose, that's significantly going to decrease crime and give relief for all of us citizens living in these communities in which we have dispensaries that are black market dispensaries, in which criminals know we're going to target them because they're an illegal shop and they're working in all cash. So that it was a really monumental day for the cannabis industry yesterday. But I think there are other markets that can learn from programs that are being adopted in California right now. So in California, we've implemented what we call a social equity program. And this was started by, I believe, Governor Jerry Brown 4 years ago. And essentially what he did was he said, hey, we have to level the playing field. Women and minorities have been most affected by cannabis crimes, and they also are not able to raise, you know, funding like, you know, men, I'll say. And so we need to level the playing field for them. So what we're going to do is we're going to put them to the front of the line for applications for retail, cultivation, manufacturing. We're going to remove all of their costs of those applications, and then we're going to provide them the support they need to run their businesses more efficiently. So we've been working with, you know, the social equity programs in San Francisco and Oakland. It's a statewide program, but it's run by the local municipalities. So they ultimately agree on what the policies are and the regulations for these programs. But they all look pretty similar. And again, it's giving preferential access to women and minorities so that we don't just become a state of chain shops that are run by one particular group. Other states are...
I don't have a whole lot of faith just with my own banking background. I've been a retail bank manager, a commercial bank manager, worked for an international commercial bank, and I didn't see any of that help. I think that having fair access to banking is essential. I think it's going to be good for the industry, but in terms of getting money to minorities and women, it's not going to help. The SBA and the existing loans out there haven't helped any of those folks, and I don't think it's going to help with cannabis. What I think it will do, though, is get investors who want to participate. It'll give them the green light to do that. And so I'm wondering, with state residency requirements like what Washington has and what Maryland is trying to do, unfortunately, is having state residency requirements for investors. So I'm just wondering how you think that will affect Maryland, and if they'll see similar I want to say disasters, maybe that's hyperbole, but there's been a serious amount of affected businesses, their growth, their success, short-term, long-term, all of it. And so I don't know, maybe that's a loaded question. Do you guys think that state requirements for residency investment requirements are hindering the industry?
They're inhibiting the flow of capital, you know, across state boundaries in the industry for sure. From Washington, I'll say Washington's perspective, because it's, you know, there's a couple of new bills being just introduced that are going to be discussed. I guess one's on Monday down in Olympia. Well, a lot of people are going down to talk to. That in a social equity perspective, I think that's one that may relate to the labor peace agreements that would allow larger spans of ownership, so you could own more retail licenses or wholesale licenses. If you had a retail peace agreement in place, a labor agreement with your with a union, that, you know, you would not obstruct as an owner their efforts to organize union activity in your shop. But one of the things that Washington has seen in that level is certainly a disproportionately white and male ownership, a lot of female ownership, very little minority ownership and things. The LCB is really sensitive to that, Liquor and Cannabis Board. Ollie Garrett, one of the board members, is very involved in addressing that specific issue, and they're putting together work groups and stuff like that. So I think there's an awareness of the issue. But to your point, Josh, I mean, in the banking thing, even if now the barriers to lending money there go, the banks are still going to do risk calculations the way they always have. And those have a tendency they're not biased intrinsically, but they tend to result in bias against groups that have traditionally been biased against. It's a bit circular, and it feeds back on itself. But the bottom line is that people that had a slow start because of the way things used to be are kind of disadvantaged even under a fair and equitable system today, because their histories aren't looking as stellar as the Harvard Yale law graduate, white male 50-year-old who's put a bit of money away over the years.
More succinctly said, cannabis cannot solve all the social ills that people keep saying it can solve. It just can't. Can we try and be fair? Yes, but the issue isn't in cannabis. The issue is in the banking industry. The issue is social equity in a much larger context.
It's encouraging that California is doing that so early into their legalization. I'm encouraged by that.
Oakland has been making in particular.
Yeah, and that's right. Oakland has, and the rules is Sacramento, Oakland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and the rules in which each municipality puts in place, they do have things like, you do have to live within that municipality. You have to be below the poverty line. You have to be a woman or minority. You have to have a prior infraction. So there are these set rules that, are in place to make sure that this is in fact a social equity applicant, someone who truly needs the support. I will say there is also, I don't want to say a loophole, because I don't think that's the right word, and I don't want this to come across as a negative connotation, but there is a loophole in which a general applicant can pair up with a social equity applicant if they agree to an incubator program in which they're saying, hey, we're going to give 1,000 square feet of space, and this is an Oakland specific program. We're going to give 1,000 square feet of space within our general applicant's location to the social equity applicant, and we are going to help them with business operation advice so that they have the same understanding as the general applicant. And so it's really trying to use the general applicant's knowledge to be able to help out these social equity applicants. And the trade-off then is that the general applicant gets their application moved up with the social applicant. So,
Yeah, we saw something very similar to the Great Wolf Lodge here in Washington State. That was a Native American facility ran by all white guys. And so hopefully that doesn't happen.
Right, my reaction is now pretty negative.
My reaction to that was a little negative, and it's because that same loophole you mentioned, Jocelyn, in that case, is what screwed up the rollout of medical here. When the LCB, when this legislature said we're going to put medical, we legalized recreational first, and still had a very vibrant, relatively non-regulated Green Cross system of medical dispensaries. A couple of years back, or almost 3 years now, they rolled them together into one regulated market. And most estimates were about a third of the consumers in the state were medical consumers. So the LCB decided to introduce 222 incremental retail access points. And they made those available on the same sort of rule guidelines you were saying, that there were certain criteria you needed. In this case, it was a history of working in the medical industry. Is kind of like being a minority in California. It gave you an advantage. And paying your taxes in the old days gave you an advantage. And this, that, the other thing. What the sophisticated, and these are a couple of lawyers came up with this, it was exactly the same loophole. You got partnerships. They changed some language in the legislation that it was not an individual. You could have partnerships that did this. And there were people selling their old W-2 forms from when they were a bud tender for 2 months at a dispensary. And that was sufficient as an owner of this new entity that was going to go for a license to give you the medical component on your loophole. And they basically, but the point is they went after that with hook, line, and sinker. And basically they pushed the traditional medical players that were just saying, oh, I'm medical, I'm a tier 1, I've got the advantage. And they were plodding away doing their thing without $1,000 an hour lawyers helping them along the way. And they just got screwed.
Well, let me push back on that. I am one of those people.
Yes, I know.
I did sweeten up someone's license to a priority 1. I had operated one of the first on the record with the state businesses that reported taxes each and every quarter. I was also an accountant in my day-by-day life that encouraged other people to do exactly that, saying this is what is going to be required for legalization. This is what the state's going to look for. Employees, and you're paying state taxes. And the federals were still pretty negotiable at that time with many people because it was unclear how you managed it. So lots of folks did a shell situation. But that being said, someone who put in a good faith effort in first tier licensing took the opportunity and had the capital to buy into some more stores, but he could only access tier 2 without someone. I was simply being told, I think it's lovely when we say we merged the two businesses. I was simply told I was out of business. There was no merge to it. I was told that I was done as one of the best practices people within the state.
So basically they're now running a quote unquote medical access point, probably without even medical certification, but certainly without one of the medical experts in the state on staff. Or as a
right, and based in outreach, right? So I grabbed what I could. This crap had cost me a lot, socially, legally, financially. I thought it was a fair chance to grab that opportunity. But you know, it was a fair market exchange. It was exactly what the state was hoping could happen. They realized they'd screwed us 2 years before, and they wanted to give us an opportunity to benefit. You know, I didn't make the rules up. I just saw a chance to mitigate some of my losses.
It was the LCB's decision. It was the LCB's decision to accept something as minimal as a W-2 for a single pay period.
That's right.
As status as a medical applicant.
I brought a business.
A piece of irony, when you look now historically at the stores in Washington that got licensed through the original recreational lottery, and those that got licensed through the medical priority-based, merit-based system, there are fewer stores today on a percentage basis in Washington that got medical licenses that are currently certified by the Department of Health as able to serve patients as patients than rec stores. A higher proportion of rec stores have gone through those hoops than the medical people.
Wow.
So it sort of goes to your point that the loophole, I suspect that loophole in California will be abused heavily.
But is it really? I mean, if you've been an employee in the state in 2012, on a day when TriNet took down an Olympia dispensary, and you're in Tacoma, and you're keeping the doors open that day so you can serve patients, shouldn't there be some benefit for you? You know, if you're the employee who stood the watch that day, what is the ultimate cost? I mean, I think I can make a social equity cost from that point of view, from a W-2, and you're working with a best actor who is taking money from your paycheck, who is paying their own taxes. You're making the choice when you could be working under the table and netting more, that you too, as an employee, want to be a best actor in the system. And this is why I say you can't paint any question in cannabis surrounding the difference from complete prohibition to freedom. You can't paint any question along the way as a binary one. There is always some mitigation that has to be done.
So I think we've got time for about one, maybe two more questions. So Jim, August 2016 saw an average basket size of $29.64. The average item was between $5 and $10, making up about 20% of total sales, and few were less than $5, and even fewer were over $75. So here's some interesting numbers. Friday, and this is all from Headset industry reports way back in 2015, by the way. Friday, they saw that 1 in 5 baskets contain edibles, a higher rate than any other day. Friday, between 3 and 5 accounted for 30% of the total basket volume. Candy and chocolates made up almost half of the total sales, and a little over half of the baskets consisted of a single item. The majority of baskets, 55%, contain only one item. Single item baskets primarily occurred in the flower category, which was by far the largest. Lower total average baskets tended to contain pre-rolls, and then vape pens and concentrates were also more likely to be single item baskets. Beverage and capsules are the least likely to be single item baskets. And on the weekends, They have a very significant effect on basket size and composition.
Yep.
So the average basket size reflects the consumer's preference of day-to-day buying, not bulk. The outlier products like infused espresso beans are still new and not sought out as standalone purchases by consumers. And then according to the legal arm of the state's Liquor and Cannabis Board, the LCB, their current traceability solution says that it meets all legislative requirements expected of a traceability solution, and yet Washington's seed-to-sale trace and tracking system hasn't been properly working since October of 2017. So I list all of that data, not to ask you a question about any of it, but just to point out that that's an awesome amount of data.
Oh, yeah.
And yet, without Headset, we wouldn't have it because Washington is literally broken. So without this awesome data, I mean, who's accountable at the LCB for breaking that? Is it who's responsible at the MJ Freeway for accepting a contract and not getting the project completed on time? Where's the culpability? And are we going to see any audits to these regulatory agencies, being the LCB or Department of Ag?
I hope so, with respect to the audits. We have seen an audit or two recently of the LCB. They were considered performance audits by the state auditor. And they basically said, LCB, you should look more closely at the data in your traceability system to try to detect instances of financial fraud and diversion of product. So they said, use the data to enforce and police better. And the LCB said, yes, sir, yes, ma'am, we will do that by the end of the year because MJ Freeway is just about ready to go. That's what they said last year. They did not make that deadline. And indeed, they have now extended MJ Freeway another 6 months, and another $2 million is being proposed for a system that is still not functioning properly.
They should just pay Headset for it.
Well, no, I mean, back to the thing. Before MJ Freeway died, sorry, before traceability in Washington died, BioTrack ran the system, and there was a database released every month that I used extensively. There was a transactional level database that had virtually everything. It was wonderful. It would allow you to do a lot of stuff, not everything that Headset does, but it was not a sample. It was every piece of data. I could say who sold, what store sold the most joints in the first 5 minutes of the business day, and you get that data if you wanted to do it. When that went away in the fall of 2017, it's been a long time. There was nothing for a while. The LCB was literally collecting hundreds of thousands of spreadsheets from the business. I have all those spreadsheets. I did a request, and it's just ridiculous. They're all in different formats. Then on February 1st, 2018, MJ Freeway launched. And the LCB itself admits now, oops, we shouldn't have launched it. Who's responsible? Who's accountable for that? It's a number of things. It's horrible project management and horrible oversight. The Office of the Chief Information Officer, I've testified now twice before the Technology Services Board down there. They manage the big projects in the state from a tech perspective. They have dedicated project management people working on it. I've basically made the case to them they shouldn't give another dollar of funding. And the Office of Financial Management works on the OCIO's recommendation to free up budgetary dollars for things. The LCB is right now trying to get $2 million extra dollars to keep this thing going. Mary Mueller, the Chief Information Officer of the LCB, the Chief Technology person, is clearly somewhat culpable as she's the head tech person there, and she's been overseeing this. Peter Antolin, who is no longer with the LCB, was the business sponsor, the chief business sponsor in the initial year of that project. He has some culpability to this. Ultimately, the board of the LCB and Director Garza have some culpability as well, because they have now had at least a dozen instances in the last year alone where the vendor has failed to deliver. They're still trying to deliver a version of the package that was supposed to be out there by March of 2018 to fix the problems with the February 1st rollout. That still hasn't rolled out. A year of contract extension later. So who's responsible at MJ Freeway? Well, they've done a really good job keeping in the business and keeping going. So I'll give them credit. Some of the stuff, when you read the documents on the Chief Information Officer's website, they track all of this stuff, and it's a disgusting read if anybody's ever managed projects before. But you wonder why people aren't being fired left, right, and center.
Yes.
I mean, I'm serious. Why aren't you firing these?
Because the cash flow is positive.
But I'm not just talking MJ Freeway. I mean, the staff, even the government staff that are letting this shit happen. But anyway, people should keep their jobs. They got to feed their families. But they're really doing a horrible, horrible job of oversight. it's as if the monies that they are paying for this stuff, the taxpayer dollars, are just a pool they can go to. Where's the culpability? I don't know. But I will say one thing. It has enabled the LCB that was getting a lot of heat for the last couple of years that we had all the data from the market. They were getting a lot of heat because the data showed there's some bad things about the way this market's rolling out. Nobody has access to that data anymore in an aggregate sense. So in that context, the type of things that Headset has done and others have attempted to do, of sampling a subset of the stores and or growers, getting the same basic detailed data, and then merging it now, which I give you kudos to, working with Nielsen and that, but merging it with proprietary surveys, demographic information, stuff like that. That's how you start getting the insights. So these insights, and when you read out the facts, I know that they are representative of the sample of the stores that are in there, but I don't know how many stores that are. I don't know what the coverage is. You know, are they biased to west side versus east side? But it's a great resource. I enjoy reading the materials on the Headset website that I look at. Will we be saying
I can answer that question. We actually are in about we see about 95% of every dollar that flows through Washington. Perfect. So it's pretty incredible, the accuracy of this data. And if it makes me feel any better, we are going through the same exact challenges in California right now, trying to implement metric. So it is just, you know, it's not an easy thing to implement.
Speaking of challenges, so Washington State specifically, they tried to implement a rule change recently that would have affected 70% of the infused or the edibles market and would have resulted in a higher compliance and ultimately probably lost potential market share. So what advice can you give to companies in emerging cannabis markets on how to prepare for a volatile regulatory environment? And we'll end it on that question. Go ahead, if you have something. Anybody?
Well,
I wish I knew the answer to this. We're like you know, it's just like speaking to California. I mean, it is just, we're in the midst of dealing with regulation changes right now, trying to get SB 67 passed through to make sure that all of these, you know, that all these producers that had temporary licenses can get annual licenses so that we can then implement metric, because metric, for example, it's only for the annual license holders. And so there are just, there are so many problems. I don't know how to answer this question.
It's one of the best stories going, was what the LCB sprung on the industry on October 3rd last year about the labeling of edibles. They basically came up with, we want to keep our babies safe from edibles, so we want to make sure that the labeling on packages, edible packages, which are limited, by the way, to 10 milligrams per unit dose, is not especially appealing to children. And it's like a farce. This is going to make a great comedy plays at some point in the future, what the LCB has done. But the industry responded and got all freaked out to saying, you're going to let a couple of analysts in a subjective dark room somewhere say, evaluate my label to say whether it's subjectively attractive to children and nix it on that basis. So we need some direction. So the industry got together and said, well, tell us what colors are going to be allowed. You know, I think they did it kind of tongue-in-cheek to show the LCB how bloody ridiculous what they were suggesting was. The LCB came back with 16 colors, 16 Pantone colors, and gave RGB equivalents. So I said, these are the colors you can use. And so they spent a whole lot of time and effort, retraced their steps, had caused an industry outline to try to make packaging subjectively less attractive to children. Well, at the same time, the organization sells or regulates marshmallow flavored vodka, one bottle of which could kill any child under 10. You know,
bubblegum, pink bubblegum.
Pink cotton candy. I mean, just the labels of them. I mean, it is regulation that in an organization that regulates a couple of poisons and a medicine that happens to have some recreational components. And they are regulating the medicine, which has virtually no toxicity with respect to killing people, mortality, and as if it's poison. And it's just bloody ridiculous. So I would like to see a day, regulatorily and legislatively, when they recognize from a social impact perspective, that just from a recreational perspective, if they could shift half of the consumption of alcohol and or nicotine to cannabis amongst those who like to use something recreationally, the harm reduction to society would be tremendous and would probably outweigh their tax benefit that they're getting off the products to start with. And if they start thinking in those terms rather than this stuff's the worst thing, you know, since arsenic, I don't know, it's
Right.
just, it would just be wonderful. But
Regulation.
we're not there yet.
I wanted to thank one of our sponsors, Candy Buds. I don't know if you've seen this down there. One of the competitors is Cocoa Nugs, but our product is way better. You can eat these. Quite delicious. So
I want one.
thank you, Candy Buds. I also want to thank my panelists. Jocelyn, you're with Headset. Congratulations on your merger or partnership, I should say. Partnership with Nielsen. Can you tell us a little bit about what Headset is and the importance of that merger, partnership with Nielsen?
Yeah, so so just first to start off what Headset is. So we're a data and analytics company that's working with the entire cannabis industry. So we have a platform for a dispensary to better understand their own data. We have a platform, a VMI platform, essentially for brands to be connected to the retail shops to really help automate that process to eliminate out of stock events. And then ultimately what we can do is, because we're seeing all of the real-time transaction data from POS systems within a dispensary, we can then help the entire cannabis industry understand what's happening in terms of market trends, category, product, brand trends by providing all of this real-time information back into the market. So we're really helping service the entire cannabis industry by making better business decisions, by understanding what's actually happening in the market, who is the consumer, and what are they buying. So, you know, our partnership with Nielsen, you know, is a really important one for us because they're going to help us understand some of the consumer survey and the demographic piece that we can pair along with all the transaction data.
That's awesome. Also want to thank my other panelists here, Grandma Cat. She is with Deep Green. What is Deep Green?
Actually, I'm not with Deep Green
Oh.
again. That mismatch with
Of
state
course.
law. I had to become the outlaw that I was for many, many years. So I'm just Grandma Cat again. You can find me at grandmacat.com, Grandma Cat on Facebook. Lucy the Canada dog has her own identity now. She got bigger than me pretty quick.
Okay.
I'm exclusively about education. I think the real power and the real decision point for us in the imminent future is, do we decide for legalization or do we decide for freedom? Education is the bridge between how you are going to feel about one position or the other of that. I'm spending my retirement years now simply truth speaking around cannabis issues.
Well, thank you for being here. I appreciate it.
And
Dr. Jim MacRae with Straight Line Analytics. What is Straight Line Analytics?
Straight Line Analytics, I come from the pharmaceutical industry where I did a lot of analytics in support of the sales and marketing efforts for my career. And when Washington went legal, and I realized, particularly when I realized that they had that database available and it was just a complete census of the industry, I shifted my attention towards looking at that and seeing how I could use that both to help the prospects of different licensees in the marketplace, potential licensees. But then ultimately I got interested in kind of the social aspects of it and the societal aspects. And the thing I've been focusing on for the past year or so has been the really consumer safety issues in the marketplace. Some of the dysfunctional regulation and enforcement in Washington has resulted in we don't test routinely for pesticides. That's likely going to change in the next year. But there's a lot of evidence that suggests randomly about 30% of the product on the market, 25 to 30% of the market, if you were to test it for pesticides, would fail the Department of Health guidelines. So the LCB's been for a year doing stuff with the Department of Ag, spending $2 million to try to test for pesticides. And you know, nothing really has come of that that's obvious to anyone. A retailer approached me, Uncle Ike's, and I got involved in designing a system where basically we bought product off the shelves of retail stores and independently tested them for pesticides, heavy metals, and the whole cannabinoid screen, and introduced consequences for products that failed. So these products, by definition, had passed all the quality assurance testing. They're for sale at retail, and we found some that failed, and it's just made a real big difference in a short period of time. So I'm trying to make the world better for cannabis consumers in this state, and ultimately, indirectly, better for the market itself.
I recently tried to pass Jim a joint, and he said, "No, I don't smoke those." And so
Well, that's
I
the reason.
had to read an article on straightlineanalytics.com called "Rolled Mold," and it's about that same testing that he just mentioned, where 10 out of 10 joints, 5 infused, 5 non-infused, 100% of them came up positive for mold. And we're not even talking about the mold to gold billboards you're seeing where moldy flower is being purchased. And so I followed suit, and I have not bought anything on the recreational market this year. And I mean, we're only 90 days in, but I haven't bought oil, I haven't bought flour. I buy from, we'll call it the medical market. Friend of mine, my friend grows
Trust.
organic.
Trust.
Yeah, my trusted market. And so it has been interesting. I really appreciate you being here, Jocelyn. So with that, we're going to roll this up. Thank my panelists, Jocelyn with Headset. I want to thank Dr. Jim MacRae with Straight Line Analytics, and I want to thank Grandma Cat
Privilege.
for being here. So don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, or don't. And I'm out.
Pleasure meeting you, Jocelyn.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn. Bye.
Great to meet you.
Bye. Great to meet you.
Excellent.